Welcome to VLGA Connect. My name is Catherine Arndt and I'm the Chief of the VLGA Connect studio. I hope you enjoy today's Connect episode brought to you by the VLGA, the national broadcaster on all things local government.
It's a big hello and welcome to VLGA Connect. The weekly governance update is here with thanks to Hunt and Hunt lawyers. Also here, of course, is Stephen Cooper from the VLGA. Hi, Steve.
Hello, Chris. Good to see you.
You too. How's your week been?
My week's been busy, but I think most people say that, so that's not particularly unusual.
No, but it really does feel like things are getting back up to a pace that we recognised from a few years ago because we've got to be out and about. I had a couple of events out in Whittlesea this week. It's really good to see people coming together again and catching up.
Well, face-to-face meetings have just been a revelation, Chris, I suppose. And we know that this year's always a busy time anyway because councils are going through and presumably this month will be getting close to concluding their draft budgets.
And I don't know about you, Steve, but I find face-to-face meetings, think about briefings, council meetings, just general stakeholder meetings, are far more effective than doing them over Zoom or Teams in particular.
I'm torn, Chris. I love a face-to-face meeting, but I've got to say that you forget how long it takes to commute to the meeting. So it's like more than half a day's gone, and what have you done? Oh, I've just had one meeting.
True, which is the argument for a hybrid approach, I guess, going forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So a bit to do today, but firstly, before Fast Track gets too much in the distance, people are still talking about what a fabulous day you put on, Steve, you and the team, back on the 18th of March, I think 2 weeks ago as we record this, yes. And we were very pleased to have the local government minister, Sean Lean, with us on that day. We sat down with him for a few minutes at the start of the day to get some thoughts from him, what was top of mind. Here's what he had to say.
It's just been fantastic, and thanks for having me at Fast Track. I attended the last one that you could have in person and really enjoyed it. So, and I think these are the sort of events that councils get so much out of interacting with each other. And put on top of that the great guest speakers, and they're great events. Yeah, well, I spent the last 2 days down at Gippsland and spoke to all the Gippsland councils in various forms. There's some really exciting projects down at Gippsland, and the councils are in partnership with state government and federal government are producing. As you know, Chris, one of my real loves is small library renovations that go so far. But the vibe's fantastic, and I have to say, I was really impressed with the Gippsland councils. I think they work really well together, all of them, and they've got great programs, and they also understand the challenges that the people in Gippsland face, and it's good to hear that firsthand. I hope in a positive way that the sector takes ownership and any change they want to see in the culture of their sector, they can advise us, and also they can decide themselves what they can do internally, but they can advise us as a state government any recommendations they want to put to me. I'm all ears.
So good to get those insights. I know the audience really appreciated having the minister there to start the day, Steve.
We've had a lot of feedback to that effect, Chris, in the material we gathered from participants. The candour of the minister, insofar as ministers are typically able, was really appreciated by the councillors with the opportunity for Q&A.
And timely with the submissions just having closed for the culture review. He'd just come back from a meeting with a few councils in Gippsland. He was actually singing the praises of those Gippsland councils quite loudly and openly, wasn't he?
Well, someone was smart enough to take him to a library, and he gets very excited about libraries, so that was really a good plan. But I think what it showed was, the councils appreciated the fact that the minister's prepared to travel, and he has been throughout his ministerial term, I suppose.
Now, in the interests of political fairness, and as it is an election year, I want to just mention that Catherine and I have sat down with the Shadow Minister for Local Government, Richard Reardon, and you'll hear that conversation in an episode of VLGA Connect that is dropping on Monday.
And Chris, one of the privileges of working at the VLGA is I have had a sneak peek at that interview, and it is terrific and worth a watch.
Thanks, Steve. Look forward to sharing that with our audience. Let's get into some of the news of the week, and it is the 1st of April. So can I just declare up front, although we did think about it, I wasn't clever enough to come up with a fake story to have people guessing. But I've noticed what does happen on this day, Steve, certainly with me, is every story you see that comes out, particularly in the first few hours of the 1st of April, you're looking at it thinking, is there a hook here that I'm missing? Is this a serious story? So far, I haven't seen one. Have you?
Your inner suspicious nature has emerged, Chris. I've just thought the year has been such a parody of itself that I'm not sure what can happen on April Fool's Day to top it. But anyway.
Even Victoria Police, now they've been known to have a bit of humour through their media unit in the past, and they put out a story this morning about a new community initiative. They're engaging with stakeholders, including councils. They've launched a survey. They're talking about this local community policing approach. I'm looking at it and thinking, this sounds great. What am I missing an April Fool's angle here? I don't think I am. I think it's a ridgy-dig, if I can say that, story, and they're to be commended for it.
Oh, absolutely, Chris. And I've had the good fortune to work closely with Victoria Police at various times in my local government career. And I know that as a key stakeholder, working well with Victoria Police is really, there's a community benefit in that. And props to VicPol for actually formalising those arrangements.
All right, so to some stories that we know are fair income. The ABC, I think, and certainly a councillor from Maribyrnong, who's known to us, Councillor Michael Clark, have been talking a lot about political machinations that are going on at the moment with lots of community events, Steve.
Yeah, I picked this up listening to 774 earlier in the week, Chris. There was a story that at more than one community festival in the western suburbs of Melbourne, and we're not political, it just happened to be the Clive Palmer's United Australia Party, were handing out yellow caps. And the suggestion was that those who might be politically less aware were being targeted with these yellow caps. And it kind of raised the question. I think one of the callers to 774 said, well, why can't the council use its local law to stop this?
Yeah. So this shades of the story we've been following with signage in Bayside recently, in terms of the free political speech issues, Steve.
Oh, absolutely, Chris. And yes, but no. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think for me, this one is around the fact that there will be, for most councils, local laws regulating the conduct of festivals, which, for example, might say that you shouldn't solicit or distribute goods without a permit, and will have provisions for stallholders. And you might take a kind of black letter reading of that and say, oh, well, the local law says that they can't, therefore the council's got the power to act in regard to the distribution of things like caps, at which time we say, just take a deep breath.
Yeah, so look, I'm thinking there was a community festival in another part of Melbourne last week. A candidate, an incumbent actually, from one of the two major parties, had a stall and was handing out giveaways. It was one of the most popular stalls because of the giveaways. The difference there, it was really clear who that person was and why they were engaging with people. I think one of the issues here is that perhaps there's not that rigour around explaining who we are, why we're doing this. A suggestion of children being targeted, for example.
Yeah, it could be a bit of that. I think it's also an issue at major corporate events, Chris, where you get suppliers who don't go to the trouble and expense of formally sponsoring, but will do, is it called ambush marketing? We'll actually just attend the event and hand out giveaways to kind of undercut the the main sponsors. So I think the question for me, for anyone organising a market, is, do you police this regularly? And if someone's asking you to police it in the case of the United Australia Party, if you're only doing it because someone's upset about the politics and you've not ever policed that particular issue before, well, maybe not. But if you are routinely, as a matter of, because remember, the local law is about peace, order and good governance, and you have these controls not for stopping political expression, but to maintain order at the event. Yes. So going back to the purpose of the legislation or the local law under which you're acting is really important, Chris.
Okay, that's good advice, Steve. Now, this story I know caught your eye. I haven't had a chance to read it this week about the Ambulance Victoria review, final report. What's happened there?
So it was a two-part report, Chris, released by the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, and the link will be on the show notes. So Ro Allen has overseen a pretty rigorous report into the culture at Ambulance Victoria, and the second part of the report was released this week, preceded by the resignation of a senior executive at Ambulance Victoria. So it sort of goes to how deep the issues were. And volume 2, the interesting part for me was that the review found that the Ambulance Victoria had adopted a range of measures intended to ensure fair and inclusive attraction and recruitment efforts, but there is still work to be done. And it appeared that there remained a culture in Ambulance Victoria that, assertive males were more likely, for example, to find themselves in roles such as MICA ambulance positions and so on, and that as a consequence of the absence of kind of equity and inclusion, that a culture of bullying still remains.
Steve, that sounds really interesting, and we know Ro Allen does thorough work through the various commission roles that she's held. What are the implications more broadly, if any, from this?
I think thanks, Chris. I think in local government, we know that, there's a culture review, that issues around, culture, bullying, harassment are really key for leaders. And interesting, when I heard Ro interviewed earlier in the week, and it sounds like I'm just spending my time listening to the radio, her comment was that board members and presumably by extension councillors, leaders in organisations need to have a look at this report and pick up the takeaways for their own organisations.
Okay, link in the show notes if you'd like to delve more deeply into that one. Steve, now this next story, this does look a bit April Fool's-ish, but it's come out before the 1st of April. The Gold Coast Mayor has a new spiritual advisor.
I've got to say, Chris, I was a bit like you. I'd try not to lurch to the April one, but it was a genuine what the moment when I saw that story. And I think the issues are around transparency and the questions being asked about, well, does Mayor Tom Tate have a spiritual advisor? If so, what's the role? Where is the Mayor getting that advice, and are we paying for it? The issue being that the person who is purportedly the spiritual advisor has made public statements to the effect that that advice is being used by Mayor Tate and the council in shaping the municipality.
Right, and of course we don't know the ins and outs of that. The source here is interesting, Steve. Should that colour it all the way in which we read this particular story? It's come from the rationalist.com.au.
My sense of it, Chris, is any concern should be taken at face value if we value transparency, and if a reasonable question's been asked, the question should be answered. And it would be nice to know for any council that they're first and foremost taking advice and considering reports and advice from the administration and dealing with matters transparently, and that where council funds are being expended, again, that there's transparency over the expenditure of those funds.
You're Mr. Tactful today. Excellent answer. Thank you, Steve.
Trying to play a straight bat on that one, Chris.
Yes. All right, moving on. The 31st of March has come and gone, and that's a significant date because councils were due to have their gender equality plans in place by that date, weren't they?
They were indeed, and that's let's be really frank, Chris. The Gender Equality Act is an important piece of legislation. It is significant in terms of that wider puzzle in terms of creating an organisation that's inclusive, because we know about intersectionality, that if we're inclusive to women, we're more likely to be inclusive towards the disabled, First Nations people, LGBTI plus community, a range of diverse groups, and that makes for better organisations. But this is really early in the life cycle, so you'd imagine a lot of the plans will be around sort of first steps. I found the Warrnambool City Council plan on the website, but I'm also aware that a number of councils have adopted those action plans under delegation. So it might be a case with local councils of seeing whether they're on their own websites is where they might be able to be found.
So I think you've answered the question I was going to ask you about an obligation of councils to put those plans through a formal process. That's not necessary. It can be done under the CEO's delegation, clearly.
Well, I know certainly from one councillor posting on social media that advised that their council had done it under delegation. So I can only presume that. So I'm also aware, Chris, that that a number of councils have sought and received extensions for the lodgement of that piece of work.
And they need to link very closely with the workforce plan that was adopted at the end of last year as well, don't they? Because that plan has to include measures for inclusivity, gender balance, all of those issues of diversity.
Yeah, Chris, and you're taking us back to the importance of being really clear-eyed about the culture that the council organisation is seeking to create. Because if you're not, then each of those pieces of work just becomes a separate but quite disjointed compliance exercise, if you like, and making no difference. What will support the culture is finding those, being clearly articulating a culture of, inclusion, fairness, speaking up, and then as those pieces of work are adopted, making sure that those messages are reinforced.
Good point again. Now, a few stories that have had my mind going to both the advantages of councils working together on big projects, but also the pitfalls. So let me give you one example. There's 15 councils in the southeast working together on an advanced waste processing project. Obviously, each council has to make its own decision about the issues behind that. And one council in this case, Mornington Peninsula, has chosen not to participate in the procurement process that have been put to them and have raised questions about the state government's role in delivering such projects. Have you caught up with that one, Steve?
I've got a layperson's view of the issue, Chris, so I'd welcome anyone who's prepared through social media to correct what I'm about to say. Look, this is the most fraught of issues because what have we got? We know that the Melbourne metropolitan area is running out of landfill space and councils need to act, and it's a bigger problem than any one or two councils can resolve. So the 15 councils have come together. But they're in that spot where they need sufficient certainty to move forward. But in moving forward, that would potentially create liabilities for the next 25 years for those communities. The process, as I understand, was to go through a PPP, a public-private partnership model, and the operator needed, in terms of their business model, some certainty from the councils in terms of the volume of waste that would go to landfill. Now, here's the kicker. The councils, as we know, are all embarking on a process or through processes at various stages of waste minimisation. So trying to reduce the waste that's going into landfill. So that kind of business model of what are we going to commit to in terms of the waste that's going in? So almost encouraging deposits of waste at the time where we're trying to reduce waste with the various penalties and incentives that will apply. And that's that has caused some nervousness at more than one of the councils, not just Mornington Peninsula. But it won't work unless there's a sufficient body of councils committing to the process, Chris.
Yes, so we'll watch that one with interest. So to summarise Mornington Peninsula's concerns, they believe that the state government needs to address the risks to ratepayers and provide some legislative certainty around the future of alternative waste. They mention an unsighted waste contract for a 25-year term, getting to that issue that you've raised. And they've called on the other councils to delay the process until a more thorough assessment of the risks. So, it's a council exercising its autonomy, it's putting a risk management profile over it, all very responsible things to be doing. The downside of this is a process that appeared to be going well now looks to be a little bit shaky.
It does a bit. And doesn't it to point to the issue, Chris, that councils in a rate capping environment will tend to be more risk averse on these issues because, the consequences for, other services and the good governance of the municipality could be threatened if the model's not right.
The other story that it sort of exercises my mind in not a dissimilar vein, not exactly the same, is this issue of the intermodal terminals, the freight terminals that have been proposed for the west and the north, Steve. And here's a situation where you've got councils, obviously, in the west that wanted to go to Truganina, and the councils in the north. And I must declare my association with Whittlesea, which is one of the councils that obviously wants to see it happen at Beveridge in the north, but has taken the view quite sensibly, I think, that both of these need to happen. So if the west comes first, so be it, as long as the north is planned. The federal government has announced money for both. The state government's questioning why the federal government is putting money in for the north. It's a little bit tricky, I guess, to the outsider to understand what's happening here, and it's could look like politics is getting in the way of decision making.
Sorry, this is like an episode of Utopia, Chris.
It is a bit,
politics actually influencing decisions about major infrastructure projects. I'm sure, in fact, there is an episode of Utopia about that.
And I'm also thinking about an address I heard yesterday from a demographer. I can't think of Simon's last name now. A German fellow, just a fascinating speaker, but talking about the need to just get ahead of population growth, make those big decisions about providing the infrastructure and not repeating the mistakes that have been made for quite some years in the West, where the infrastructure hasn't been there, but the population growth just keeps coming.
Absolutely. And this goes to questions around, if you like, the ethical obligations of government decision makers and of planning ahead, because it goes to the quality of life of people who will eventually live in these places, Chris. Isn't it interesting too that there is, and being a double election year, an extraordinary amount of politics between federal and state governments. I did see this morning that the federal government has been critical and cast doubt on the suburban rail loop project. There's been other issues where there's just been a bit of disagreement between the feds and the state government about, ultimately federal funding coming to state government.
Yes.
Decisions. And you would have seen some of that in the steps that have been taken to get to where we are with the airport link.
Absolutely. And there's been a couple of instances of, for example, the Albury-Wodonga regional deal, federal money announced, local council money announced, no state participation as yet. So what that felt like is the federal government, ahead of an election, go figure, has decided to go forward, despite there being no state government commitment locked in. We've had a couple of examples of that type of decision making being made. The intermodal terminal is another one. And there's a big question mark around the Melbourne's Northwest City deal, which was announced, I have to say, before the last federal election. Nothing's actually happened, and we're on the cusp of another.
Yeah, I don't know if we need to come back to the intermodal issue where we started, Chris, except props to Whittlesea and Mitchell in terms of the advocacy that's been done on that process. And really, in a long-term sense, there needs to be work done on rail freight, over decades. So we need to keep investing there. The other thing, Chris, just as an aside, I noticed that Moira and Indigo Shires and two of the councils in New South Wales that abut have formed a partnership to lobby for that region. And I think all power to those councils, because it's quite apparent that in infrastructure lobbying to federal and state government, that councils just can't go it alone.
So on that point, look out for the interview with Richard Reardon that we're releasing on Monday, because he's, as the Shadow Minister, has got some interesting views on those regional alliances. To put it very simply, he doesn't think they should be necessary. I do make the point to him that councils have learned that governments and departments prefer to deal with groupings because it's more efficient, obviously, and there's this strength in numbers approach that has been proven to work over many years. So I thought that was an interesting view, and we'll unpack that with him in the interview you'll see on Monday. Yeah,
you won't get the answer next week, but if there was a way where individual councils weren't burnt by these sorts of decisions, then absolutely.
All right. Still got a few things on the list. Just looking at the time, I think we're going to have to start heading into the home stretch, Steve. Perhaps a few news items. Charlie Bird, the CEO at Alpine Shire, has announced that he won't be seeking a new contract when his current employment contract runs out in July, so Alpine Shire is setting out looking for a new CEO.
In fact, it's been a bit quiet on CEO front for a couple of weeks, Chris, which is quite extraordinary. But good luck to Charlie and good luck to Alpine Shire in that recruitment process.
So there's 7 on the list that are yet to be announced. My mail is 1 or 2 are very close, Steve. So any tick of the clock, we might hear an announcement or 2 there. On the councillor front, Kat Bennett at Wodonga has resigned since our last episode due to work commitments. The really exciting thing here is, Steve, I found out that Kat is a regular rusted-on listener of the Local Government News Roundup.
We don't want a trend, Chris, where people get their name listed on their favourite or mentioned on their favourite podcast, and the only way they can do it is by resigning. So please be better.
True. But the other point I did make there is when you look at the countbacks and by-elections that have been held since the term started, 13 of those 19 have been resignations, and 9 of those resignations have been female councillors.
Yeah, interesting, Chris. We were talking earlier that there was a bit of a flurry of activity with the VLGA early in the council term. There was 1 resignation at Northern Grampians before the councillor had taken the oath of office, a couple of other positions at, I think, West Wimmera or maybe Hindmarsh, not sure, and Northern Grampians filled an election, and they need to be filled. But it seems like the last 6 to 9 months there has been like a steady stream of resignations, of which the majority appear to be women, which is concerning.
It is concerning trend. I haven't done the numbers from the last term, but I've got to say, Steve, when I did have a quick look, I was surprised that there were so many in that 2016 to 2020 period. So maybe the number's not that odd. I will do a bit more analysis of that, but that ratio of female councillors standing down to male does appear to be a trend that we perhaps should be looking more closely at.
Chris, I look forward to throwing a comparative graph up on this show in a week or 2.
Oh, there's a challenge. Now, another piece of executive news, many of our viewers and listeners would be aware of Catherine Dale, who, of course, was in Victoria for some time, CEO at
Nillumbik and Burundara.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Excellent operator and a decent person, Dr. Catherine Dale.
Yes, indeed. And she's been the general manager, equivalent of CEO at Eurobodalla for 9 years. But she's also announced this week that when her contract is up later in the year, she's stepping down and she's going to head on to the university lecturing circuit.
And she'd be very good. So we wish Catherine well.
Back to Mornington Peninsula very quickly. They've passed a resolution to seek a new council status of peri-regional. I understand Yarra Ranges is on board with that as well. By my count, that would make 6 classifications of council types in the state. And they're making the argument that it would provide benefits of being regional as well as being metropolitan. I do wonder, Steve, whether some of this comes from being treated as a metropolitan during COVID when they're, clearly largely regional.
They weren't happy about that, Chris. But equally, they're not an interface council as such, because whilst they certainly abut the metropolitan area, there are elements of rural and significant elements. So for some of those councils, their issues are different in terms of responding to new development, but at the same time preserving the lifestyle of well-established communities.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see if that gets any traction. We asked the Shadow Minister about that as well in our interview coming on Monday. Let's see, 2 more things. The new local government minister in South Australia is a former mayor, so that's good to see, because you don't always get people in those roles making decisions on behalf of the sector without that relevant experience. Yeah,
that's interesting, Chris. And look, everyone brings a unique perspective, so I don't think it's mandatory. But certainly previous ministers who have been mayors have, demonstrated a different kind of commitment to the sector.
I think that's right. So this is Jeff Brock in this case, who was mayor of Port Pirie Regional Council and was there for at least 6 years on that council. And finally, on a sad note, again, since our last episode, we had the news that Deb Ganderton has passed away. Now, a lot of people in local government came across or had dealings with Deb, myself included, back in the days when I was involved in the communication space, as of course Deb was for many years at a number of councils. More recently, she was the CEO of the Greater Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust. And with that hat on, I had some dealings with her both at Hobsons Bay and more recently at Whittlesea. Great loss, a real force around the sector, and she'll be missed.
Oh, quite apt, Chris, that we've got. In fact, we possibly need a brighter blue background, because I think Deb was sort of synonymous with, bold colours and a bold personality. And those that met Deb were always struck by those meetings. So sadly missed.
Indeed. All right. Thank you, Steve. On that note, Vale Deb Ganderton, and we'll wrap up the governance update for another week. Our thanks to Hunt & Hunt Lawyers, as always, for being sponsors of this program. What sort of a week have you got ahead of you, Steve?
Another busy one, Chris, but we're sort of getting into a bit more of routine, and I think also a couple more face-to-face meetings. Yourself?
Yes, pretty much the same. Looking forward to it, because, of course, Easter is barreling towards us as well. Thanks, Steve. Talk next week.
Cheers, Chris.
Steve Cooper, Chief of Staff of the VLGA. That's your governance update. Thanks for your company, and see you again soon.